So we talked previously about the notion of a social network. And briefly to review, the idea of a social network is you and all the people that you know. You and all the people that you know are called nodes in that network. And there are links between those the nodes in those networks that are based on the fact that you know these people. And we said that Facebook uses social networks to make recommendations to you. Facebook uses social networks in order to target advertising to you. And Facebook also gives you this view called the social graph that allows you to see those. And that furthermore, those relationships can be grouped so that we have different subunits, we have different places, kind of groupings of people who are more connected to each other than they are to other people. And those are groups, and now Facebook allows group functionality as well. And that it kind of stops at the point of naming all the relationships the same way. It names everybody as a friend, so the only kind of link, the only kind of edge, as Facebook would say, between two people is the fact that they're a friend. And that we know in real life there's a lot more complexity to it than that. We have these symmetrical and asymmetrical relationships. Okay, so let's move from the concept of the social network itself to the idea of social systems. Now, there's a lot of vagueness in the terminology here. I just said social systems. Sometimes we talk about social networking. Sometimes we talk about social media. Sometimes we talk about social apps. You know, how do we straighten all that out? Well, for one thing, you can see that when there's a lot of variability in the vocabulary that people use, it's because they haven't actually figured it out yet. Different people coin different words. Those words all are kind of in play simultaneously, and eventually we'll have it sorted out. So let me try to sort it out as cleanly as I can. And what I see is probably better captured by this idea of Web 2.0 than by any of the social words. Web 2.0 is the idea that in the World Wide Web right now, you talk back. And that's clear, you talk back a lot. Now, I have to say that it wasn't like in the beginning you couldn't talk back to the web. But it was more or less in the beginning of the web that most people used the web as a broadcast medium. They would put up a page and they wouldn't expect you to really do anything. It was all about us talking to you. And a lot of websites are still that way, right? They're basically about us talking to you. You consume the information and we don't expect anything more from you. But more and more, and especially in the applications that we care about, the ones that we're going to study in this class, the information systems that we're going to be talking about, there's a backwards communication channel as well. There's them talking to you, and then there's you talking back to them. Or there may not even be a them there. It may be you talking to other people that you know, right? That's how it works on Facebook. You don't really talk to Facebook. It's not really Facebook telling you stuff. Facebook is in the background, and you're talking to other people. You're talking to your peers, your social network. Okay, so lots of names for basically the same thing. But what it boils down to is when there's back and forth, and we're going to call this a conversation in just a moment, when there's back and forth, there's the social thing going on. And whether it's social media or whether it's social apps, I don't really care. And you'll see me dropping those terms and interchanging those terms. If I had to choose a term, I think I would call them social systems. Or I would just call them interactive systems. Or I would just call them information systems, which is what I like best. These are information systems where there's communication going in both directions. All right, well, let's dive into these social systems now and talk a little bit more about what's going on. So what I would like us to see, what I'd like us to focus on, and what I'd like us to use as an analytical tool for talking about these kinds of information systems is the idea of an electronic conversation. When you facilitate, when you create on your system an electronic conversation, either between you and them, or between them and them, or between you and other yous, whoever you're creating that conversation with, then you're in the social sphere, because that's what socialness is all about. I mean, think about it. Isn't that really what socialness is all about? It's about conversations. It's about people interrelating. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that, you know, if you were mute and everybody else was mute, we'd still be social people. We'd still, you know, maybe use touch or something like that to communicate, but we'd actually still be communicating. We'd be passing meaning from one of us to the other. And so for all intents and purposes, socialness really is about communication. It's about passing information from person to person, and in that way forming bonds, forming connections, forming feelings of solidarity and trust, etc., etc. Okay, so social apps, social applications, social systems, they support these electronic conversations. information fits into there because information is what's exchanged. When you type a status message into Facebook, you're exchanging information. You're putting information and you're giving that information to all the people who are listening to you. So information is how it's exchanged. These social applications, social media, social networking apps, whatever we want to call them, that's the medium, that's the channel, that's the way it's exchanged. So what we're going to focus on is the communication. So let's look at communication. What happens in a conversation? Well, I'd give you these 4 basic ideas. In a conversation, somebody speaks. If no one's speaking, and I mean speaking metaphorically, when I post a video or when I change my status message or whatever, I'm going to call that speaking. I'm producing information. I'm creating new information and putting it out. Right? So there's always someone speaking. And if there's no one speaking, there's no conversation. There's someone listening. If I speak, like right now, basically I'm speaking and no one can hear me. Right? I'm hoping that someday you watch this video and you can hear me, but no one's hearing me right now. And if I don't ever produce this video and it never sees the light of day, then this was not a conversation. This was me. Well, I suppose you could say it's me talking to myself. And if I'm talking to myself, am I having a conversation? I guess maybe only if I'm listening to myself. Right? So at any rate, you get the idea. If there's always going to be somebody speaking, and in order for us to call it a conversation, there has to be somebody listening as well. Now, in addition to listening, that person could be responding. I'm going to assume that as you listen to this video, you're not talking back to it. If you are, then you're responding. You may actually be talking back to it in your head, and I think that kind of counts as responding as well. So if you think that way, then you might be able to say, well, you know, you can't really listen without mentally responding. And so if you're mentally responding, there's always a responder. But let's keep it much simpler than that. Let's say there's always a speaker. There is always a listener, otherwise it's not a conversation, and that listener may choose to respond, and we'll call it a response if they verbalize it, if they put it out, if their response is not internal inside their head, but their response is to you, the communicator. But they don't have to respond. They can sit there quietly and listen, as most people do in class. They sit there quietly and listen. They're not responding. They're not talking back. But they can. And in a conversation, you can respond. In a conversation, you can also repeat. So I'm talking about this right now with you, and then later on in the day, you meet with one of your friends, and you start discussing some of the things that you heard me say as well. You're repeating. You're beginning or entering or using the conversation in order to forward on information or a piece of conversation that you heard elsewhere. Okay, so speakers and listeners, mandatory. Responders and repeaters, not so mandatory. But hopefully, that's kind of what we like. That's kind of what we do when we create these conversations in social systems. All right, so we have these roles that happen inside of a conversation. Let's talk about some of the conversations themselves, how the conversations themselves move forward. Okay, the big one, right? The one that I think all conversation is ultimately based on is this idea of 2 people talking, 2 people in interaction, 2 people speaking, listening, and responding. Speaking, listening, and responding synchronously, meaning at the same time. Synchronous means they're doing it at the same time. They're face-to-face. They're in real time. Those are all ways of saying synchronous. Things like real-time chat in audio, video, or in text. Those are all face-to-face, two-way, dyadic, sometimes it's called, conversations. And this is really the paradigm. This is the kind of the place that we all get to. And I think it's useful to understand also that it's probably the most powerful form of conversation. And think about it yourself. When you're talking face-to-face with somebody else and you're actively listening and responding, isn't that the most powerful way that you have of communicating? Right? It's really kind of the fundamental way. Okay, so that's way number 1, a dyad, 2 people talking, listening, and responding synchronously. Next, what you might call broadcast conversation, where someone speaks and a lot of people listen. Arguably, what you're involved in right now is a broadcast conversation. I recorded this video. You're listening to it. Lots of other people are listening to it as well. And so there's one speaker and lots of listeners. And then there may be a few responders. Like, for example, you might post a question about this video, or you might ask me something in class about this video, or you might call me up and say, oh, I don't like what you said about that. That's a response, but the responses are really pretty few and far between. In general, what's happening mostly is that there's a speaker broadcasting that message out to the whole world. Now, I'll contrast this idea of broadcast and narrowcast. In broadcast, it's the same message. This video isn't different when different people watch it. But suppose I knew enough about all the different people that were watching this video to include certain segments and cut out certain segments depending on who you were, depending on what I thought you already knew, or what sorts of arguments might appeal to you, or what directions you might like me to take it. Same basic message, but I'm customizing it based on what I know about you. That's the idea of narrowcasting. I'm still the one speaker bringing it out to the large mass of people, but now the message is a little bit different. Same central thrust, but a little bit different depending on what I know about you, what I think about what would be best to give to you. Broadcast, narrowcast. Okay, so in that case, we have a single speaker usually, we have lots of listeners usually, and we have very few responders usually. So we have the one-on-one conversation, the dyadic conversation, we have the broadcast conversation where one speak and many listen, and then there's a few other ones that I'd like to talk about as well. This one you might call the party metaphor. Lots of people speaking, listening, and responding synchronously at the same time. By the way, the broadcast one that I just talked about could be synchronous or asynchronous. It could happen in real time, like if we're in a lecture hall, or it can happen asynchronously now, where each of the different viewers, each of the different people watching this video watches it at a different time. Asynchronous means not at the same time. Synchronous means at the same time. So in this conversation that we're looking at now, lots of people talking at the same time. They're speakers, they're listening, they're all interacting in kind of a crowd. It's like a party. And a party is a lot like that. Lots of conversations going on at the same time, people coming in, people coming out, lots of people speaking, listening, and responding all at the same time together. Got the idea? Okay. Then we have the same thing going on, and what I just talked about was synchronously all at the same time, but now the same thing can go on. Lots of people listening, responding, speaking, and listening, responding, and speaking, but they're not doing it at the same time. They could do it over long spaces of time, like we see in a typical comment thread inside of Facebook. So somebody posted a comment, and then over the next, whatever it is, day, 2 days, usually doesn't last much longer than that. Why? Because after that, it's scrolled off the bottom of your screen and out of sight, out of mind on Facebook, right? But for the time being that this conversation is at the top of the screen, there's lots of people speaking, listening, and responding all in their own time, asynchronously. So we have the two people listening, speaking, and responding synchronously. They can also do that asynchronously through chat or something like that over the long range. We have a broadcast where it's one person and lots of people listening, and it could happen synchronously or asynchronously. And then we have these two varieties of the party. There's the synchronous party, everybody at the same time in the same place. Doesn't mean that it's not electronic, right? It doesn't have to be a face-to-face party. You could be, in fact, a lot of times, and I'm sure you've experienced this, a lot of times these Facebook conversations are in real time. They're synchronous, and everybody's on Facebook at the same time, and there's just this whole huge conversation that's going on all in real time, right? So the synchronous versus asynchronous is not necessarily distinguishing one type of conversation from another. It's just that it's different modes for the same sort of conversation. Okay, then finally, this idea of many people speaking, listening, and repeating in an asynchronous way. So the classic idea here is the idea of telephone, right? Where I tell you something, then you turn around and tell it to somebody else, and we know that as people repeat, they don't always repeat with high fidelity, right? They don't always repeat exactly what they heard. They add interpretations to it. And in fact, I just heard the other day a story about how as we repeat something, especially if there's a long time in between repetitions, so you tell a story and then a long time later you tell it again, that story changes significantly. And they gave an example of a guy telling a story and then a week later telling the same story and then 3 weeks later telling the same story, and the story 3 weeks later bore very little resemblance to the story that the guy originally told, because it changes in our mind and we don't remember things literally. At any rate, I add this kind of conversation, because it's very important. And in fact, a lot of what social media wants us to do is repeat conversations. And we'll see in a moment how that repeating happens. But I want to distinguish these kinds of conversations. In this one, it's not so much that it's a party and that people are having this extended conversation going all over the place. It's the idea that the idea itself travels from person to person to person, and as it travels from person to person, it kind of takes on a life of its own, and it morphs and it changes. So this is the telephone idea, if you've ever played that game Telephone. And in fact, you see here that this is a Norman Rockwell painting. I really love this Norman Rockwell painting because it really shows this idea, right? It's kind of the idea of gossip, that information is moving from place to place to place, and as it moves from place to place, it kind of morphs. Okay, well, why am I dwelling so much on these different kinds of conversations? Why have I gone into such detail about the different ways we talk to each other? It's because I think it's a really, really great way to analyze social applications. And if you keep these different modes in mind, speaking, listening, responding, repeating, if you keep these different modes in mind, you'll have a lot of ways of taking apart an application and maybe even ways of enhancing or critiquing or designing a new form of those applications. So to understand a social app, figure out its conversations. And let's start with Facebook. In Facebook, we have speakers, we have listeners, we have responders, and we have repeaters, right? All of those are represented there. But there are different combinations, there are different kinds of conversations that are favored. And I've listed them here in the order in which I think they're favored. And I think the most favored is when people are speaking, listening, and responding asynchronously. That's the conversation that Facebook was really designed to have. It's the kind of the center. Now, you might ask yourself, is that the right kind of conversation? Should it focus on dyads? Should it focus on broadcast? Well, I mean, how should it work, right? But to my mind, this is the one that it's kind of centered on, the one that it wants to facilitate the most, and it's really designed around that. And then, of course, you can have speakers, responders synchronously. Facebook doesn't care whether you're doing it all at the same time or you're doing it over an extended period of time. It's equally useful in both of those cases, with the exception that when you do it asynchronously, the conversation tends to go off the bottom of the page and is never heard from again, because if you wait even 5 or 10 minutes, a bunch of stuff comes in on top of it. You don't see it on the top of the page anymore, and away it goes, right? So it does favor it favors a synchronous conversation a little bit in that way. As a broadcast medium where one person speaks and a lot listen, yeah, I think you can make that argument, because there's lots of people where you're just looking at their status updates, you look at the video they posted or whatever, and you don't respond at all. And what it basically means is they've told you about what's going on and you haven't responded back, right? So it does support that broadcast type of conversation. In fact, it doesn't support at all a synchronous broadcast, because there's no notion of me talking immediately and you hearing. I mean, and when I do a status update, yeah, it comes up to the top of your screen, but that's, yeah, I suppose you can make the argument that it supports synchronous as well as asynchronous broadcast conversations. But the point I'm trying to make here is you can get a lot of insight into Facebook by looking at it this way, by looking at the kinds of communication we have, the kind of conversations we have, and how Facebook deals with that, how Facebook facilitates or doesn't facilitate those. Okay, so the two, speaking, listening, and responding, not so much. I have heard of cases where two people will create fake Facebook accounts and they'll have their own little world, right, where it's only those two people, and in that case it is doing that. It doesn't stop you from doing that, but that's pretty rare. The usual cases are the many, right? Many people are involved in Facebook, and that's kind of why we like it. If we wanted to do the other thing, maybe we would just as well use chat or something like that. Okay, and then what does repeating mean? When I like something, I'm repeating it, right? And think about that. When I hit the like button, all of a sudden it shows up on my wall as well as on everybody else's, right? I've given other people the notion that that's something you should look at. And likes are a way of information spreading. Now, interestingly, we'll see in the electronic world that because you can have a high fidelity, like exact copy of what you liked, right? No changes, no interpretation. It doesn't morph over time. When I put it in my brain and then take it back out of my brain, it's going to morph. But when I hit like, all it does is make a copy, and that copy is exact. So one of the things that we're doing with electronic information is we're taking out that evolution out of it. And in fact, instead of information morphing over time, which sometimes is a really good thing, it morphs into a better form than it was before. Instead of having that form of conversation, we're having replication, we're having duplication, we're copying the original and posting it on. Okay, so that's an analysis of Facebook using this idea of conversations. Let's look now at Twitter. Twitter is also a social app, not one that we're going to talk about directly, but Twitter will come in and out of our conversations throughout this course. What does it favor? I would say it really does favor the broadcast. Twitter, for the most part, is a medium in which I say something and then I spread it out to my social network. And here, I'll go a little bit out of order here because I think this is the most important aspect of Twitter, is the retweet. Retweet equals repeat. right? When I retweet something, I'm literally taking it and I'm forwarding it on. Now I can add my own little nuances to it, but basically I'm copying it and sending it out to my network. I'm letting it flow through my Twitter followers, right? It came in from somebody that I follow and it's going out to the people who follow me. And in that way it can spread very, very rapidly. So the conversation that I would say it favors most is where one person speaks and many people listen and very few respond. There's very few people who are going to engage me in a dialogue, which is not to say that they can't. And in fact, sometimes that does happen on Twitter. We have the Twitter wars where we're going back and forth and there's a lot of controversy. It does do that. And that's number 2 on the list, where synchronously now, a lot of people are interacting with each other. So the asynchronous conversation is the one that Facebook more or less is designed for. The synchronous conversation is the one that Twitter's designed for. It's this real-time thing. Now, again, not a hardcore distinction. Facebook does facilitate synchronous conversation, and Twitter does facilitate asynchronous conversation, but in general. Then the 2 people speaking, listening, and responding on Twitter kind of defeats the purpose of Twitter, right? It's really not a dyadic communication tool. Okay, and as I said, repeating is the same as retweeting. When I retweet something, I'm repeating it and sending it out to my social network. Okay, one more. Let's do Wikipedia. What kind of conversations go on Wikipedia? Well, I would say the major kind of conversation that goes on is many people speaking and listening and responding asynchronously. Now let me back up, because you probably have a fair idea of how Twitter works. You probably have a fair idea of how Facebook works. But let me explain just briefly how Wikipedia works. Wikipedia, as you'll learn as you get later into this class, is a bunch of people collaborating on an article, right? It's all sitting down together, jointly typing the article. And it's as if everybody has their fingers on the typewriter at the same time, and they're all contributing to this article simultaneously and editing each other's work. And the idea is that a really awesome article emerges from that, from all these people interacting and co-editing the same article. And I think in a lot of cases that really works. In other cases it doesn't work quite so well, but in general it does work. So I would say the major conversation that Wikipedia favors is where many people are speaking and listening and responding to each other asynchronously. Now at the same time, a whole other aspect of Wikipedia is the way that we usually use it, which is we do a Google, the Wikipedia result comes up to the top of Google. We'll talk about that when we talk about Google. Why is Wikipedia always at the top? And in that sense, it's a broadcast, right? Because most of the time when I go to Wikipedia, I'm not going there to edit it. But Wikipedia was designed, that was the point of Wikipedia in the first place, was to allow people to collaborate in real time or asynchronously on an article. But when we go to Wikipedia and we use it like an encyclopedia, what we're doing is we're getting broadcasts. It's no different than going to an encyclopedia, opening it up to page 32 and reading what's on there, right? It's one article, many people all experiencing that article. So it's that one person speaks, many people respond, many people listen, and very few respond, because very few people are going to go in and edit the article. And then many people speaking, listening, and responding synchronously, it doesn't really facilitate that much. I mean, if you ever tried to edit a Wikipedia article at the same time that other people are editing it, it's really kind of confusing and hard, because you change something and then you refresh the page and it's gone, right? And you're wondering what the heck happened. It's really not like a conversation on Facebook in that sense, because you're all editing the same chunk of text. And so having it happen synchronously in real time is really pretty difficult. And then 2 people speaking, listening, and responding to each other on Wikipedia really doesn't facilitate that at all. Now, of those 4, which is the one that wasn't facilitated by any of our social apps? You got it, right? Number 4, 2 people speaking, listening, and responding. How come there's no social apps that are good at that? We have chat, like an IRC chat. We have video chat, Skype, for example, when I call somebody up and we have a communication like that. But none of the social apps really focus on that. So I'll leave it as a question to you as to why is that one so ignored? If it's so important, and my contention would be that as far as human communication goes, a dyadic conversation, me and you talking face-to-face, is the most powerful form of conversation. But none of our social apps seem to focus on it. Why? Think about that, and maybe we'll talk about that in class. Okay, so when I link to something on Wikipedia, that's when I'm repeating it. So when I make I have an article about Afghanistan, and I link to Taliban, then you go over to the Taliban page. I've in effect repeated the Taliban page. I've I've brought the Taliban page up one more so that you can find it from more places. Okay, that's the notion of social applications and the idea of how those social applications work. Social applications work by facilitating electronic conversations. If you understand the nature of conversations, if you understand what participants there are, speakers, listeners, responders, and repeaters, and you know what kind of conversations happen, broadcast conversations, face-to-face, one-on-one, dyadic conversations, party-type conversations, then you have a really strong way of looking at these applications and dissecting them, and not only saying how do they work, but starting to ask yourself, how should they work? What could we change about them? What would I like to see? What kind of social applications do I think make sense? Under what circumstances should we use each of these different kinds of social applications?